The Future of Teamwork is a Leader production. Subscribe today and never miss an episode.
We know it to be true that teams are units of creativity. They're the ultimate generative model, right? Because in a team versus an individual, you just have access to so much more potential and information and curiosity and energy. You know that idea that we're only ever conscious of 2% of the total amount of information that our bodies are processing at any one time. What happens when you get into a team is that you can unlock in each other the 98% under the hood a bit more, because if I'm coming just to my prompting with an AI, I'm just going to be narrowed into whatever is in the top of my consciousness. But if I start to hear you talk about what you're interested in, that's actually going to activate something in me that would have otherwise stayed latent and under the surface.
Welcome to the Future of Teamwork podcast. My name's Dane Groeneveld, and today I'm joined by a fellow Australian, Jacob Taylor. Jacob's got some cool titles, a fellow at the Centre for Sustainable Development at Brookings. He's also running a consultancy, Two Hands, that really focuses in on team performance, bringing tools and techniques from elite performance into organizations at inflection points. And we've got some really cool content to cover today, from where Jacob's come from into where he's hopeful for teams in the future. So welcome to the show, Jacob. I'm excited to dive in.
Thanks, Dane. Thanks for having me.
So I know when we met up there in San Francisco a few weeks ago, and we did the usual Australian thing of like, hey, where are you from? You were kind of a little bit cagey and you started with like Sydney, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how this all got started and the journey you're on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so a little bit further out from Sydney, about 4 hours southwest into country New South Wales. And I think these days I try to explain to people that I'm on this holy grail search for team performance and the special sauce of what makes teams work. And yeah, if I really take it back, I think a lot of those questions formed early days where I grew up. Probably first in my family. I'm the youngest in a small team, and that was always like, how do I play my part here and make the team work? But really it was like on the sporting fields of country New South Wales, like rugby league, cricket, anything you could get a handle on or throw around with people was kind of where I started most of my life. So that always informs this question of like, what is it? What is that special sauce that can bring a team together? And when it clicks, it's incredible. Like the rush of just being in sync with your team on the sporting field is one of those big intuitions that drives me. But I've also been in teams that don't click, and the feeling of that going south is also like quite strong. But anyway, so all of that led me eventually to a career in professional rugby. I played, in Sydney for several years, and then for the Australian Sevens team for several seasons, and traveled around the world, and again saw different teams at the highest level of rugby playing in different ways. But in parallel, as an anthropologist at university, I studied these questions as well, got really fascinated by how to talk about, how to understand it at a more kind of academic level as well. So that kind of set me off to journeys after that. But
that's pretty neat. And I really appreciated when you were on stage there at that Candidly HR conference, when you kind of scanned back out to the anthropological, the earlier times of humanity, and perhaps even some of the skills and the way of being connected to each other and the earth that we've kind of lost track of. Was it that was starting to pull you further into, doing your studies at Oxford and going down that track, or what kept you in that space, having, been a professional athlete and going back to school?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the questions around high-level performance in professional sport were very front of mind. But then in another life, in parallel, I was heading off to China. So I did my exchange and did a gap year in China studying the language and hanging out with rugby players in China, because that was how I figured that, 4 months into China, my first trip, I could barely speak a word. Even though I was studying it, but I just couldn't. It was really hard to get lift off. And a mate of mine, Ed Kuss, actually heard that there was a rugby team down in the local sports school, sports university. And he was from Melbourne. He only played AFL, but he's like, "It's all right, I'll wing it. Like, let's just go down and see what we can do." And you play rugby, right?
Yeah.
Let's go do it. And that was it for me. Like we went down there and we had a shared language that wasn't, you know what I mean? We had this common language that we could build on and build relationships around.
Yeah.
And sure enough, like 6 months later, we were thick as thieves with these guys who are all from country towns across the north of China, and we were in Shenyang that year. And yeah, that was our ticket to immersion and connection in a foreign place. And so I think, having this combination of questions about high-level team performance and being, a guest in another culture and being like, wait a minute, it's not just like one way of doing it. Humans can do this in all sorts of ways. And so I think that really always expanded my mind to like the possibilities of not just going deep, but also trying to figure out what's in this that could be applied elsewhere, maybe.
That's super cool. Yeah, there's definitely something there in the being thrown into a new environment, a new culture. We often see it as well when we talk to guests of the show on the power of a stranger. Like if you're in a team and you've got a very firmly held belief about what your team's doing, how you do it, and then a stranger comes in and they start asking questions, you kind of open up a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in a way that was anthropology for me, because after that year in China, I went back to undergrad and I was doing an arts languages degree, so liberal arts for our American listeners. But I didn't really know what anthropology was, but someone was like, "Oh yeah, it's a study of humans." And I was like, "I've just been blown away by diversity of humans in this trip to China for a year." And I remember going in there and my first professor actually was insane. He was literally frothing at the mouth. He was so passionate about the way that pigs were exchanged in highland tribes of Papua New Guinea as a source of social currency. And anyway, so I was just like, "Whoa, this is it. Like, this is a field that is asking the questions that I'm fascinated by." And I think, to your point, part of the toolkit of an anthropologist is to go in and just ask questions and see what comes up. And I think that's a fascinating way of coming to knowledge and also just trying to articulate what makes us human, basically.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I read that Guns, Germs and Steel, the Jared Diamond book, which was awesome. But I also worked in Papua New Guinea, and I remember one of our safety briefings was if you hit someone's pig in the highlands, you go straight to the airport. Like you just created a really big problem.
Big time, yeah. It's insane, yeah. Well, there are many more stories about Highland Papua New Guinea tribes that we could dive deep into, but maybe we should keep it on team.
But when you sort of come from that work, so from the sports field to different cultures, deeper studies, and now into the corporate environment, teams that are trying to build products or services and change the world. What is it that you've seen, in that quest for the special sauce that's been like capturing your attention, and how is that changing now, over time with technology kind of starting to flood in through the windows?
Yeah. The two dynamics that I see are pretty age old, I think, and this comes a little bit from anthropology. I currently use the language of soul and structure. So every team has a soul, a human substrate. And every team has some form of structure as, strategies, rules, stuff that's codified, norms, the stuff that feels solid and structured.
Yeah.
But those two don't always work in sync. So you can have a structure that's so binding that the soul of the team is not going to actually come out in ways that you want to help really drive performance. And instead, the soul will come out in maladaptive behaviors, in, passive aggression, or people pulling back and losing motivation.
Yeah.
And so the real special sauce for me is, how do you really meet a team's soul where it's at, like really come in to who people are, what they care about, why they turn up to work and problem solving together, and then develop a structure that embodies that and sets that free, basically. And so I think that's pretty age old. People like culture eats strategy for breakfast and all this kind of stuff. It's the same thing, but I just think it's so timeless and human that that's what drives me in two hands and in my work at Brookings, just to figure out how do we get these two things working together.
That's neat. And when you think about that, I love that structure and soul combination. But if you think about the soul of a group, like let's say you've got a small team and you're like, here's the soul and the structure's not quite aligned. Is there ever a question then of, well, are we going to build the structure around the soul of the group that we've got, or do we need to change out the band members, the teammates?
Yeah, I think, that's always a decision call for leaders. But my basic sense is that soul, like the human substrate, is rich and it's dimensionally complex. Like there are so many ways that people can show up, and that's often dictated by who else shows up. And that the way you can see that express itself is so rich, whereas structure is often lower dimensional and less degrees of freedom. And so often when people are like, what's the solution, the silver bullet to teams, I always say, well, look, if you've seen one team, you've seen one team, and the way in which a team, even the same group of people, can show up given a different structure, I think is huge. And so I'm a big believer in soul first, then structure. But if a team and relationships are really calcified around a structure, and another thing I think I've seen over the years is people don't change.
Yeah.
Which sounds a bit contradictory to what I just said, but
No, but I've seen it too.
You know what I mean? And so sometimes you do need to make the call. Well, yeah. And so, and there are a lot of movies and books and stuff that all say once you remove one key piece or two key pieces and bring new life into it, then things start to unlock. So
yeah,
it's always a balance, and I think that's a tough business of leadership, and getting a sense of which way to go on which problem. But yeah, I do think I'm team human on our capacity to reinvent and evolve. So
yeah, me too. It's interesting when you talk about that calcification around the structure, because one of the things my old man used to always say was that it's easier to change people than to change people. And I'd be like, huh? And he goes,
right.
It's, it's not that people can't change. It's just that they don't want to for fear or whatever it is. So sometimes you do need to just be like, hey, the structure is this. Like we're running a mine in a hazardous operating environment. We can't change the structure. And if this person's not falling in line with these behaviors, human behaviors around safety, for example, you're not going to be able to coach them into it once you've gone past a certain level.
Totally, yeah. I think that's a really good point as well for all this team stuff, is often that question is a bit over-determined by what team you're working with and in what bigger organization. And so I tend to work a bit more with smaller teams, startups and smaller ops, where there is a bit more room to change structure on the fly.
Yeah.
But if you're working within big orgs with set structures, then maybe your ability to move within that or embrace change is going to be harder, and so you make different calls.
The size and complexity raises another question there, Jacob. I had a really adverse reaction when Jack Dorsey came out with his changes at Block earlier in the year. And he's just like, we're going from 10,000 to 6,000 or whatever it was. It was a big drop in people. And we're changing the structure of how we work. And I was like, oof. It felt like we were just getting rid of managers and going to super ICs. I've since learned that there's a bit more to it than that. But when you see a 10,000 employee company change that quickly, and you think about soul and structure, because I would imagine with that magnitude of change, both of them are moving.
Totally.
What sort of questions does that sort of pop up in your mind? Where does the curiosity lead you?
Yeah. Well, I guess to your point, a bit of empathy to the folks who will let go, because it's such an uncertain time at the moment, and that's real. And starting there. But I also think there's one of these bigger questions, well, what is meaningful work? What is soulful work where you're motivated and able to turn up? And I think sometimes there's a little bit of nostalgia for the type of work that a lot of us end up doing, and so I think I'm always trying to push towards a hopeful reimagining or reinstating soulful work. And so a few pointers for me on that is, again, a little bit of cognitive science here on like the group size limits of teams, right? So, which you've probably gone deep on as well. But, a nice flat team is kind of 4 to 7 people. And once you go beyond that, you need some form of leadership or norms or structure to keep all those folks together. And so the most soulful units for me are pods of, 3 to 7, 4 to 7 people working in close sync around shared goals, that they know each other, they know their stories, they know their backgrounds, they know their hopes and so on. Like if you can get those units working at that scale, then I think you're in business. So if reorgs start to think in that logic starting, then I'm kind of open-minded to what that could look like, particularly as technology, AI in particular, might be shifting the job functions and the titles to a more fluid way of working, less specialization and differentiation of tasks and more kind of like playing different roles around a shared set of goals.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that would be one starting point for me. Well, we could go further on different dimensions.
I love that
What do
you
you think?
raised the pods. I've always had more through lived experience than through good science. I've always had an affinity for these sort of pods, and the way we would build businesses is like build a couple of these good teams that have very clear defined purpose and boundaries about how they go and do their work. And then once they're starting to like crack at the seams, you break them in half and you're like, okay, go and replicate. And it just worked. But I think that was in a time earlier in my career where it was fairly clear what business we were going after and how we were serving it. Where I feel like now there's so much change in the landscape of, well, are our customers still going to buy what they bought last year? And who are there new customers emerging? And are there new tools that we should use? And what is the competitive landscape? So nowadays I feel like even in that pod structure, there needs to be some kind of connective tissue around the outside of the pods that's listening for the signal and maybe giving some inspiration or direction. So maybe the model that I was used to was perhaps a little bit too autonomous and isolated.
Yeah, and I get what you mean. And one case study I read, which maybe you've seen, is this Dutch primary care nurse company. It's called Herzog. But
I have heard of
Herzog.
I believe so.
And, so they kind of deployed this model that you're talking about. Is like they grow a team of 10, max 10, which is really pushing the limits, but for what they did. And their job was to deliver care, in-home care, I'm pretty sure, something like that. But once they got to 10, then it was time for a new team of 10. But they kept scaling like this, which was insane to see how quickly and big they could do it. I think they got to 10,000 employees in a couple of years using this model, just like scaling up. But have to fact check me on that, on the details. But I think there's also this narrative at the moment that with AI, okay, we can just like get rid of middle managers and we'll have these pods running around and agents will be intermediaries of that kind of institutional, who needs to connect to which pod and what needs to be fluid versus what needs to be structured and so on. I'm a little bit fascinated by this, and this is like what I spend a lot of time trying to think about in different contexts. But I guess I'm just a bit of a, at the end of the day, there needs to be human in the loop of this stuff. There needs to be that wisdom of connectivity as much as the information layer, if that makes sense. And I always think it's going to be a humans plus technology in that domain. But I agree, what the thing that this technology is doing now is really expanding the amount of information we can capture and carry around with us, but we've still got to figure out the signal from the noise and use that to create business value. And so I think there are a lot of like detailed questions here that are left to be figured out.
I'm glad you touched there on the wisdom, and then earlier you also touched on with the smaller teams, the relationships, shared objectives, but also relationships, because I think the relationship's the one thing that is central to all good work. You asked earlier, what's the definition of meaningful work? I think you need to be working in relationship with other humans. Some people to a lesser degree than others, but I think that's the one where the AI is not going to know that Jacob and Dane get on great. And even if
Right.
it does see some signal, hey, we worked really well on this project, it won't know in the context of the next project when you throw 3 different team members in and a different tech stack or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
So
totally. And it's also like that's the human part. Like, let us keep that. Like,
yeah,
like deploy AI on the lower level stuff that we don't want to be in the spreadsheets all day or putting that information into a spreadsheet. That sucks. We just want to be getting on and connecting and using that as a launch pad for better work. And so I think if you get that balance and positioning of the tools right, and they're more than tools, of course, they're very intelligent kind of pseudo agents that can come along for the ride, but still they kind of need a understanding where they fit in the human layer to support it, not to like overtake it, I think.
yeah.
So yeah, I'm kind of interested in ways where the AI layer can provide efficiencies, context, the stuff at our fingertips for us to have better conversations like this that lead to better work. But yeah, I think to your point on relationships, it really does boil down to that for me. And often people think about a team as this kind of homogenous thing that is above everyone. But really, in my view, having gone deep on some of this and my own experience, it comes down to individual one-to-one relationships to define the strength of a team. Like any great team, for example, has a Lennon and McCartney dyad somewhere in there, or we could pull sporting metaphors for days, but you know what I mean. There's always these like special magical dyads that actually help scaffold up a great team, and that's not always like pure friendship and connection. Sometimes it's conflict and tension and going against the grain, but having a container in which that can happen across different dyads is really, I think, what makes it special. Yeah.
I love that you brought up the Beatles. One of my favorite stories was the story of Ringo Starr joining the Beatles. Had you heard that one?
No, please tell me.
But going about dyads, so they said McCartney
Yeah.
and Lennon were just like insane, like brilliant.
Right.
And they were just going off into the ether
Right.
with where they could take their music. And Ringo Starr comes into the group to replace the former drummer. And he's like, guys, like, our audience can't pick up a guitar and play our music. Like, let's make it simple first. And apparently it was that kind of constraint that he brought into the epic dyad of McCartney and Lennon that then started to kind of really build their momentum. And they then bring a lot of change to the world through their brilliance. So it's really interesting seeing how those little dynamics of humans and wisdom and intuition just show up.
Oh, I really love that. So, and that's kind of extending the dyad thing to like the triad, the quad. Like, yeah, but that's really cool. The other music one on my mind with this stuff is Fleetwood Mac's Rumours album.
Tell me more.
Which is one of the best rock albums ever made. But came at a time for the band where the chaos in the system was huge, right? So they're all like, I won't go into the details, but I think a lot of folks will know this, like, different dyads were uncoupling and swapping with other dyads and,
it's free love.
Musicians and but highly tension filled free love. And it was, but also at a time where they had to land this record. They were broke. They had a few good albums, but they were kind of going hard in life and partying and so on. And so they got to a point where this record had to hit. And so they had a really tight shared goal of survival in an environment with high chaos, like, where there's maximum entropy. And like bubbling, but then in a world where they all had to work together. And I think when you go deep on some of the science of team performance, you actually see this pattern of high entropy at the start and then teams finding a way to bottle that and push it through the pipes of performance. And that's what they did. It's created some of the best rock music you've ever heard. And, I don't know how they ended up at the end of that performance cycle, whether they, but yeah, anyway, I just think the dynamics of that are really fascinating. Sometimes that like chaos of Lennon and McCartney's generative idea with the constraint of Ringo, or the constraint of a performance objective of a deadline can be helpful. Yeah.
Super helpful. It makes me think, I've been doing some research around this for a while now, and people often think about teams and teamwork as soft. Oh, we're going to go and do trust
Right.
falls and ropes courses and all of this other stuff. And there is a softer element, like of braiding teams together, whoever the dyads are going to be, whoever you're going to add in. But then there is like a crucible moment. And I think what you just described there with the Fleetwood Mac example is that crucible moment where I think people who come through tough things together, number one, they can achieve things in very different ways. But number two, I think it brings some, what do they call it? Like it brings more of a bond, sort of an effect that people are like, hey, we came through that hard thing together. I'm sure you would have seen that in your rugby days when you come through a game when you're behind or something like that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and that was actually core to my PhD research, really, was this relationship between the way people perform together on the field and how that leads to connection or social bonding or emotional connection kind of off the field, if you know what I mean. And those two work hand in hand both ways. You know, if you click off the field, that's why it's good to do some of the, so-called soft stuff to get a sense of each other. So when you get on the field, you have a broader kind of motivation to work together. But I was really interested with high level performance of the way in which competency and expertise, like that high level of expression on the field, is such a powerful signal of commitment to your team member. And so particularly in a high stakes contact sport like rugby, where there's nowhere to hide, and you played rugby and been around the sport as well, you can tell the moment you get out on the field, you can tell how committed your teammates are by the level of commitment they show to their craft. And it's just so diagnostic of how much they care about the team. And so that was like, for me, that I really drilled down on that as like competence as a real potent signal of connection, and that teams really, it's the light that the moths of the team really get around. It's like, oh, who's got that drive and flow in them, and we want to get more of that and be around that and bring our own version of that to the team.
Yes.
And then that's really where like the team click kind of comes from, where people start to really ramp up around that energy. So yeah, and I think those two sides of team performance of like competence and bonding go hand in hand. Some of my mates also think that, like, and particularly in the work I'm in now in, global problem solving, it's like, before you start talking about solutions, let's just get together, let's get some cocktails going. Like, let's meet people as humans and then we'll go to work. Whereas other people are like, nah, let's get to work and then we'll build the relationship.
Well,
so it's always a
piece
bit,
again, isn't it? Is what I'm hearing you say. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
What's cool about that, and I love the way you brought up people both being committed to each other and practicing their competence or their craft at the highest level when they are committed to each other. We've built that in a lot of our research around what a healthy team is. We talk about competence, we talk about commitment, we talk about confidence, and then we actually talk about camaraderie. So we we look at a lot of that. But competence is the one I want to dive into here for a minute, because as AI is coming in and there's all this talk about super ICs, what you would traditionally look to each other for on a team is like them coming in and practicing their craft is shifting, and people are shipping work that I don't think is necessarily true of their former competence or level, because they can ship so much more work now. And they're also then relying less on each other because Claude can help them get through something that they used to go and talk to Maggie down the hall on. So like, are you seeing that shift in competence in reverse then actually starts to decay commitment on teams?
Well, I'm definitely seeing the first part that you described. Like, I do think we're in a bit of the slot cannon era of AI assisted work. And partly because a lot of that work is happening at the individual task level, rather than, I think we've talked about this before, right? Rather than being established at the team level. So there's a lack of shared team context within which people are shipping their own task, but then that gets to the team level and you have to kind of get the signal from the noise. You have to sort the slop out from the good stuff and
Yeah.
so on. And so I think that is deteriorating team energy and morale, definitely, seeing that across some teams. But I think you're seeing high levels of team performance with teams that have high levels of existing expertise in a domain and judgment. And they're kind of using that resource that they've accumulated over careers or study or whatever to like get value out of these tools. But I think over time, the pattern that you describe is certainly going to play out. And for me, then the question is, what are the new competencies and signals of expertise at a few layers, right? There's like a human only judgment stuff, which I think needs to always be core, but then there's always also going to be this like human plus AI synergy space and a new muscles of writing and reading and all these things that we learn in school, arithmetic. Like there's going to be a new set of those augmented skills that I think we have to figure out how to discern quality and share as well. But I'd like to learn more about what you're seeing, that idea of like the more people rely on the tools, the less they rely on the teams or the people in the teams, because our research is really showing that the more you unleash a human to human conversation as an input to the AI assisted workflow, the better results you get out of the models. So we're saying like, don't drop that. Like, in fact, put that up top of priorities and then let the work filter down into workflows. So
That's what it's,
yeah.
and I think you're touching on this, your team vibing paper.
Yeah, vibe teaming.
Vibe teaming, that's it, vibe teaming.
Yeah.
When you talked about vibe teaming, I haven't actually read the paper yet, but when you just explained it to me at the conference, I was like, wow, that strikes a chord, because I'm living through a lot of this conversation, in my own teams and in teams that we serve, about people just throwing around AI into the work and it getting messy, and about this kind of breaking down of mattering. We had Zach Mercurio on the show the other day, and we were talking about mattering, and he's just like, if you can't go to another human on your team and say, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't have got to here, then work becomes so much less meaningful to each other. And then that can start, that to me is what brings around some of the decay in that team cohesion. So I'm guessing at the breakdown in commitment just by reversing your flow, but I'm definitely seeing that competence piece too. Tell me a little bit more about how you said it's, let me get it right again, team vibing.
Vibe teaming.
Vibe teaming.
From vibe coding
There you go.
to vibe teaming.
So tell me a little bit more about vibe teaming and how that might be bringing people back together at the front end of the work.
Yeah, I mean, but that's it, right? I think what we say is we know it to be true that teams are units of creativity. Like they're the ultimate generative model, right? Because in a team versus an individual, you just have access to so much more potential and information and curiosity and energy, such that that idea that we're only ever conscious of 2% of the total amount of information that our bodies are processing at any one time. There's a little bit of truth to that. What happens when you get into a team is that you can unlock in each other the 98% under the hood a bit more, because if I'm coming just to my prompting with an AI, I'm just going to be narrowed into whatever is in the top of my consciousness, and I'm just going to be running on that. But if I start to hear you talk about what you're interested in, that's actually going to activate something in me that would have otherwise stayed latent and under the surface.
Yeah.
And so to one-on-one, you can do that back and forth, add a fourth person in, all sharing the same goal, and all of a sudden you're firing off at each other and surfacing all this rich information that would have stayed tacit or maybe not even surfaced at all. And so in that sense, I think sometimes people think a bit glumly about how silicon's going to rip through biology and our poor old human minds are not going to be able to keep up, which there is a bit of a mismatch there in the speed and scale, but really there's so much potential under the hood of human biology and intelligence that we're just yet to unlock. And so for us with vibe teaming, it was really saying, okay, well, let's start with that potential up front. And if we're thinking about bringing AI tools in to help us with our work, let's define that work as a human team first and record a 30, 45-minute transcript that's structured around like, what are we trying to achieve? Can we push our thinking to the edge of what we know? What really matters? What does good look like? And then use that rich transcript as a lead into the AI workflow. And as it turns out, when the richer and more, the more you have in that package of first context with the model, the better the models perform anyway, because they're hungry for accurate niche context to keep the probabilistic nature of their systems working in ways that make sense. Otherwise, like the less context you give it, the more mid and kind of annoying AI becomes. But the more specific and rich information you give it, the better it can help you. Yeah,
It's interesting because that takes me back to that Herzog example. Because they were clearly doing some vibe teaming when they came up with how to make the 10-person teams and serve the problem.
I think so.
And
yeah.
then, albeit they weren't using AI probably at the time.
That time, no.
But
yeah.
in the analog, it must have been like, it doesn't sound like they just stumbled over 10-person teams works. It sounds like they became very intentional by solving some of the problems of the patient, the provider, and
Yes.
otherwise
Yeah.
without being deep on the case study.
I think you're right, and that it speaks to this idea of like empowering the people closest to the problem to be the definers of the solution or the space that you want to work in. So I think in that case there was almost like an anthropological priority to be like, what works up close? Like, how do we solve this problem? Who do we need? What does it need to look like? And let's just start there at the edge and then be like, okay, let's just scale that, rather than being kind of divorced from that information and starting to try to create workflows and charts and org charts and stuff that don't make sense for the end users or problem solvers, basically. So I think there is a bit of that. That's the same. What we try to get in these vibe teaming conversations is really tease out that expertise at the edge of the problem, like from people who are at the interface of the issues. Definitely.
When you approach vibe teaming properly, can it be done by the intact team, or do they need a facilitator, an outsider, someone to be pushing and prodding to get the edge?
I think teams can take on the structure of these conversations. Every team will have their kind of set of key questions. In policy, we have these 5 questions we keep coming back to. What's the problem? What's the solution? Very specifically, not just like hand wavy. What's the strategy that'll get us to the solution? What's the action plan? Who needs to do what by when and how? And then like, what don't we know? What are the open questions? So for us, those 5 questions keep coming up, and they're actually pretty transferable to a lot of kind of strategy work generally. But it does help sometimes in a team if you have like a problem owner who's really like, I'm trying to crack this, help me do that. I think that energy works because you can start to ask the problem owner first and then build out to what other team members might help them with.
Yes.
So I think it works really well with that kind of setup. So Dane, you're like, team, I've got this issue. Can you help me crack it? And that recording that conversation is going to be great for you to then go and implement a workflow.
Brilliant.
With AI. Yeah.
And I actually love the way you frame that as a problem owner asking for help from a team, because that's the thing that I think is breaking down now. So if you can do that, number one, it creates gratitude, and then it builds trust too. Like particularly if I'm coming to a more junior team member as a leader and saying, hey guys, I need help with this, then I think that's huge for just the human connectivity.
Totally. I really like mattering, as I hadn't come across that before, but we'll go in on that, because I think that interdependence, this feeling of my fate is connected to yours in what we're doing, is so key for high performance. And so, that's great that it feels like that's maybe a bit of a movement that people are understanding around.
I think
the work
it's coming. Like last 12 months, there's been 3 books on the topic, and I think it's landing in all circles too, from like childhood development and education into the workplace, into end of life. Like it's Zach himself on the podcast said it's coming up through the fact that people are lacking it. I think that's why he thinks everyone's really attaching to it right now, is because they don't have a lot of that mattering right now. So this is bringing us to a great point. I know pre-show we were talking about what excites you, and that's kind of the expansion of agency of the team. to bring change into the world, to really be the change agents. And I think you've talked a lot from the soul and structure into, how the confidence and the commitment and the competence is showing up. And now this vibe teaming gives us a really cool way to do it. Before we dive into perhaps where that goes, I've got one question that's just been rattling around in the back of my mind. We talked earlier about pods and teams of like 3 to 6, 4 to 7, whatever it might be. But a lot of our research and lived experience is starting to say, hey, Jacob, you're not just on one team, you're on 3 teams at once. So if you've got this high degree of belief and energy for teams being change agents and bringing a lot of really positive things to the world right now, do you sense that those teams need to be intact for a period of time and have no other team distraction? Or do you think that teams can be a little bit more dynamic and individuals can be dropping in and out fractionally through the workflow?
Yeah, I think that's the way, that unbundling of teams and organizations is something we're seeing pre-generative AI. I think, the kind of casualization of work and the gig economy and all these kind of things were pushing technology, and digital technology in particular is pushing us in that direction of testing the boundaries of traditional boundaries of teams and work and organizations. But I think what's interesting at the moment now is that whereas in a previous era of technology, pre-generative AI, I think the users of it were technology takers. Like there was this feeling that like if I'm an Uber driver, I just need to take the job that's given to me. And, the only way I can really push back on that is to kind of collectivize and say, hey, no, like don't let your algorithms just like push me around. But there was no technical pushback. Whereas I think, just to shift away from the Uber, because I'm not sure how to actually do it in that context yet, but in the team context now, I think there's so much more agency to ship your own computing environment. You can actually say, no, I want to define the way we work like this, and I can actually build the digital infrastructure to support that way of working. And so I feel like with these new wave of tools, there's more agency for individuals and teams at a smaller scale to actually define the infrastructure that they want to work on.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting shift for me. So then it becomes less about like, how do we design across a whole org the way of working, and more about how do each individual and team want to work.
Yes.
And who do they connect with bottom up. And then the role of the organization becomes less about defining that top down and more about providing an infrastructure for that to emerge.
Interesting.
And so that's where I think there's an interesting moment for teams and individuals. And I think at the moment you're seeing, elite software engineering teams like rip through and reinvent organizations with Claude Code and other open source harnesses and kind of define what they want. And a lot of them are leaving or demanding more pay. And so there's this kind of like bottom up value being demonstrated. And I think work will shift around the more power they get to define that, the more we'll see that world change. But then I'm interested in like, how do you track that and say, how does that apply for knowledge work teams or less technical teams or teams that kind of are less in big organizations, but more like they spawn around a shared problem, and how do they connect with other teams who are working on similar things elsewhere? And so I'm interested in all those new institutional arrangements that could allow that bottom-up energy to take place.
Yeah, the bottom-up energy makes a lot of sense in that setting. And I think having worked in some fairly frontier project environments, building new facilities in the deep jungle or desert or wherever it might be, I've always been enamored by some of the stories that pop up there when you're like, hey, there's a small landholder group that's connected with a small other company, and they've developed this really innovative way to, take work uniforms and clean them and get them back to teams. And then all of a sudden they're adding food and this and that and the other. And all of a sudden this business just spawns. And it's like playing the missing notes in and around that large project environment, because the big corporates come in and say, we're using this equipment and we're going to be deploying these large organizations to engineer and construct, but they don't think about sort of the connective tissue of the project as well. So I've seen bottom up work in those environments, but what I'm hearing you say here is that we're going to see a little bit more of that frontier creativity, that pioneering spirit that might be popping up as teams right now in big cities and big organizations start seeing problems to solve, things to play to.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there'll be bottlenecks and blockages to this energy. But I hope to see in organizations the courage to create the conditions for it to come bottom up, because it's ultimately going to be where new value is defined and formed. And I think you're seeing this a lot with like traditional software companies that are having to reinvent themselves and so on. I think in that environment, there's a tendency to close down the hatches and say, oh, we've got this valuable company or data or IP, and we're just going to shut it down and like try to leverage the value. But I actually think the decision for leaders, the more courageous decision, is actually to open it up and be very kind of generous about it. Invite their teams to use it to build new things, incentivize them, reward them to do so. And at the same time, not in doing that, you actually invite other people in. We talked about the light and the moths before. It's like, if you're a system of record for work or whatever it is, like invite people to come onto that infrastructure and build on it and then like create value around that. So I think it's like the knee jerk is close off and protect, but I think the real answer might be open up and provide infrastructure for humans to let loose on and be creative on. Yeah.
I like that a lot. It's a big shift for a lot of boardrooms to be thinking about how to be more open. But to your point, the fact that the technologies are now available and people can self-select into their way of working based on technologies, like you can already see it, like Slack as an example. There's a lot of people that like to work in Slack. Slack has a marketplace model, so people could be building on and in Slack very easily. People already are, but I'm sure there's other channels that we haven't, probably to your point, yet thought of as channels that could be emerging here in the months and years ahead.
Totally. I think for me, and we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago in SF at the Candidly event, that it really will be a shift of taking AI and technology out of the IT department and putting it in the strategy department.
Yeah.
Because it is infrastructure for value creation now. It's just like infrastructure layer stuff. It's not tools for specific problems and in that setting, I think, there's going to be a real need to think about how to empower individuals, teams with the digital context they need to get the best out of the tools and the power of the models. And so that kind of leads a bit to this context maxing work that we've been doing recently. It's just like, what's the infrastructure layer for an individual, for a team that's beyond just Slack, but including Slack? Like Slack's a great capture of digital context, the traces of interactions and so on, the calls that we're on where we're discussing these things, the in-person meetings that can be recorded, the notebooks that we all have kept on our laptops, so on and so on. Like, how do you create a web of that and empower people to pull from all those places in a way that they make sense to them to create value? And I think that is going to be a transition from tools to infrastructure for a lot of organizations and making it more horizontal and interoperable. And that's going to be a challenge because a lot of like SaaS vendor business models are all like stovepipe solutions for X, not always integrated. And so I think the courage to like open that up, build your own, like it is more possible now for orgs and teams. So I think there's going to be a bit of slop and mess as we work through it, but I think it is a moment of like homebrew, garage band solutions actually can work better now. And so let's experiment and work with that. Yeah.
I love that. I'm all about the homebrew garage band vibe too.
Keep it scrappy. I think scrappy is a good substrate for creativity,
Yeah. And what I love about this conversation from like the early piece of like, you're trying to experience like just immersing yourself in with some people who are about the homebrew or the garage band or something where you can find connection and togetherness, to be curious, to build common language. Then you're getting into the soul and the structure and the right team size. And that naturally brings you into this, whether it's the vibe teaming, the context maxing, it brings you into this moment where you don't need all of these grand resources and tons of money to really start making a difference. And that's an exciting outlook for the future of teamwork.
Totally. Yeah. No, you said it better than I could. So yeah, I'm excited to be part of that work, I guess, to really empower teams. Because I do think, the power of our human, the soul part of this equation is so much bigger and grander and ancient than the structures that we come up with day to day to make sense of it. And so if we just keep finding a way to stimulate and energize that, our biology, our humanness and so on, then like I'm hopeful. But it really does need a sense of power and like speaking truth to power as well. So there's a political dimension, there's a cultural dimension. Like we need to spread ideas around the importance of this, which are, I think, a bit suppressed at the moment, but people are hungry for it. So yeah, that's part of the work we do, trying to do at Brookings, is bring more of these kind of bottom up ideas and options to policymakers and say, hey, here's some stuff that if you tweaked a few dials, we could actually really give people more power in this equation. And so that's a lot of what gives me, what motivates me in my day job. Yeah.
That makes total sense. And I can actually see it more clearly now we've had this conversation, how that ties into the Sustainable Development Goals and breaking some of the inertia and opening it up.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Absolutely.
Well, Jacob, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation. I got so much energy from it. If any of our listeners want to find you, your papers from the Brookings Institute, the work you do at Two Hands, like where do they go and seek you out?
Yeah. So check me out on the Brookings Institution website. Just Google Jacob Taylor at Brookings. That's where a lot of my research is. And then you can add me on LinkedIn, and maybe I could drop some more information on Two Hands in the show notes or
cool. Yeah, we'll do that with Alicia.
Always open to great conversations about these topics. So hit me up.
Cool. Well, thanks for making the time today.
Thanks, Dane. It's been a real pleasure.
Just a quick note before we go. The views and opinions shared in this episode are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, Dane Groeneveld, the Leader Group, our patron Huddle 3, or our partners and affiliates. Any scenarios discussed are for the purpose of fueling creative thinking and conversation, and should be viewed only in this context. Dane, Leader, our sponsors, partners, and affiliates do not endorse any guest or any organization they may be associated with. It's important to remember that every workplace is as individual as the people within it. Our recommendation is to always seek solutions that are specifically designed to help serve your team's unique needs. And to this point, please know we're here, ready to help you find the best way forward, no matter where your starting point is. You can connect with Dane or myself, Alicia McCraw, on LinkedIn or via the links contained in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. And hey, if you think someone in your network would benefit from this episode, feel free to share it or give us a 5-star rating. Those 5 little stars really help us reach more curious people like you. We'll catch you next time on The Future of Teamwork.